The morning settled over the valley without ceremony as it often did, spreading pale light across the frozen ground and softening the sharp edges of ice and stone. The rescue team moved slowly along the ridge, their boots pressing shallow marks into untouched snow. They had come to survey the lower basin after reports of unusual animal movement, expecting perhaps to find scattered tracks or signs of migration delayed by the sudden cold. Instead, their attention was drawn to a shape lying far below, dark against the endless white, unmoving in a way that did not belong to any living creature. Through binoculars, the form resolved into the body of a male lion. His mane, once full and sunlit, lay flattened against his neck, dusted with frost. He was positioned awkwardly, one foreleg stretched forward, the other bent beneath his chest as if he had tried and failed to rise. Snow had gathered lightly along his flank and tail, settling there without disturbance. For several long moments, the team watched in silence, uncertain whether they were looking at loss or at something still holding on. Then, almost imperceptibly, his rib cage lifted. It was a shallow movement, barely enough to shift the fine layer of snow resting on his side, but it was there. A breath. Then another, slower still. One ear twitched weakly, responding perhaps to distant wind or to sounds too faint for human hearing. His head remained low, heavy against the frozen ground, but a slight tremor passed through his jaw, a small sign of strain and effort. The valley itself seemed to hold its breath with him. Thin sheets of ice lay scattered along a narrow streambed, catching the light in dull fragments. Wind slid quietly through dry grass at the edges of the plain, lifting and lowering it like a slow tide. No other animals moved nearby. No birds crossed the sky. The lion lay alone in a space that felt emptied of motion, as though life had retreated to watch from a distance. One of the rangers lowered his binoculars and spoke barely above a whisper. "He's still breathing." Another nodded, eyes fixed on the distant figure. "Barely." They began their descent with careful precision, choosing each step as though sound itself might disturb the fragile balance holding the lion in place. As they moved closer, more details emerged. His paws were stiff with cold, pads cracked and pale. Frost clung to the edges of his whiskers. When the wind shifted, his nostrils flared weakly, drawing in air that seemed to offer little warmth in return. At their approach, his eyelids fluttered. One eye opened halfway, revealing a dull, clouded gaze that followed their shapes without focus. A low sound escaped his throat, not a roar or a call, but a thin vibration, more breath than voice. His body attempted a small adjustment, muscles tightening briefly before giving way to exhaustion. A handler knelt several meters away and spoke softly, letting the words drift on the cold air. "It's okay, easy." The lion did not respond directly, but his breathing steadied for a moment, settling into a fragile rhythm. Steam rose faintly from his nostrils, dissolving almost as soon as it appeared. Around him, the valley remained vast and silent, snow stretching toward distant ridges, wind tracing invisible paths through frozen grass, as sunlight crept slowly higher, brushing the edges of ice with quiet, fading gold. Snow began to fall more steadily as the team moved closer, thin flakes drifting sideways in the rising wind and settling quickly against coats, equipment, and the uneven ground. What had once been a clear stretch of white slowly blurred into layered shades of gray and pale blue. Visibility narrowed, compressing the wide valley into a quiet, enclosed world of falling ice and muffled sound. With each careful step, the rescuers felt the temperature drop further, the cold tightening around exposed skin and slowing every movement. From a closer distance, the reason for the lion's stillness became painfully clear. His hind leg disappeared beneath a fractured slab of ice and stone, where part of the stream bank had collapsed under its own frozen weight. Jagged fragments pressed against his thigh, pinning it at an unnatural angle. The fur around the trapped limb was darkened with melted frost and faint traces of dried blood, stiffened by cold. Every shallow breath caused a slight tremor to pass through his body, but he made no attempt to pull free. The effort had already been spent. They positioned themselves in a slow arc around him, leaving space, keeping their movements wide and predictable. No one rushed. No one spoke above a murmur. Tools were set down gently on packed snow. Gloves brushed against fabric without sound. Even the wind seemed to lower its voice around them. When one rescuer leaned forward to study the rock formation, the lion's eye shifted weakly in response, tracking the motion with dull caution. "It's wedged deep," someone whispered. "We'll take it piece by piece." Snow gathered on the lion's mane and along the curve of his back, melting slightly where warmth still lingered beneath his skin. From time to time, he released a faint breath through parted jaws, a soft rasp that barely carried beyond his own body. His tail lay motionless, half buried, except for an occasional small twitch when pain pulsed through the trapped limb. When metal touched stone, his ears flattened briefly, then relaxed again when no harm followed. Hours unfolded in quiet fragments. Rocks were lifted one at a time, shifted slowly, tested for stability before being removed. Ice was chipped away in small, careful motions, never in sharp strikes. Between each movement there were long pauses, moments when everyone simply waited, watching his breathing, allowing his body to settle again. During those stretches, one rescuer remained closest, kneeling low, maintaining a steady presence without reaching. "Easy, you're doing good," she murmured once, voice almost lost to falling snow. Gradually something subtle changed. The lion no longer tensed at every nearby movement. His eyelids closed more often, opening only when tools came close. His breathing, though still weak, grew more regular. When a gloved hand brushed lightly against his shoulder to steady a shifting rock, he did not flinch. Instead, he remained still, conserving what little strength he had left. By late afternoon, the snowfall softened into thinner strands, drifting lazily toward the ground. Light faded behind cloud cover, and the valley seemed to dim from within. Around the trapped lion, small piles of cleared ice and stone marked the slow progress of patient hands. In the quiet space they had created together, breath met breath, snow settled gently, and trust formed without words, carried on the steady rhythm of shared endurance. As daylight thinned behind layers of cloud and drifting snow, the valley began to lose its sense of time. Shadows stretched and softened at once, dissolving into pale blue and gray. The rescuers no longer measured progress by hours but by breath, by movement, by the slow loosening of stone beneath careful hands. Each action unfolded with quiet restraint, guided less by urgency than by an instinctive understanding that force would undo everything they had built. Cold settled deeper into the ground. It crept through boots and gloves, numbing fingers and slowing reflexes. Still no one rushed. Every fragment of ice was tested before removal. Every rock was shifted by millimeters, not inches. The trapped limb remained mostly hidden, but more of its outline had emerged. Fur matted, muscles rigid, skin drawn tight by swelling and fatigue. The lion lay almost completely still now, conserving what little strength remained. His breathing was shallow but steady. Each inhale lifted his ribcage slightly, enough to stir the snow resting along his side. His nostrils flared faintly, drawing in cold air that left no warmth behind. When tools scraped softly against stone, his ears tilted backward in brief reflex, then returned to rest. He no longer reacted with tension. Instead, his body remained heavy against the ground, trusting the stillness. One rescuer stayed closest, positioned low and visible, never crossing into his direct line of sight without warning. When she shifted her weight, she did so slowly, letting fabric whisper against snow before moving further. Her presence became part of the landscape around him, as constant as wind and shadow. Over time, his half-open eyes stopped tracking her every movement. It rested instead on the space just beyond her, unfocused, tired. "We're nearly there," she whispered once, more to the moment than to anyone else. The final obstruction was a slab of ice fused with stone, lodged tightly against the lion's thigh. Removing it too quickly could send pressure back into the joint. Removing it too slowly risked prolonging pain and shock. The team paused for several minutes, studying its angles, tracing invisible lines of tension. Hands hovered, then withdrew. Breath fogged the air in quiet clouds. When they began, they worked together without instruction. One steadied the slab. Another eased a thin metal wedge beneath it. A third applied gentle pressure from the opposite side. No voice counted time. No signal was given. Their movements synchronized naturally, guided by shared awareness. The lion stirred as the pressure shifted. His jaw tightened. A faint sound rose from his throat, low and strained, then faded. His forepaw flexed weakly, claws barely extending before relaxing again. For a moment, his eye opened wider, revealing a dark, reflective surface that caught what little light remained. It fixed briefly on the nearest face, then softened. "It's okay, easy," someone breathed. The slab shifted. Not suddenly, not dramatically. It eased away with a dull, muted sound, releasing its grip inch by inch. As the weight lifted, the trapped leg settled into a more natural position, trembling faintly under its own return to freedom. Blood flow resumed slowly, visible only in subtle color changes beneath damp fur. The lion exhaled in a long, uneven breath, his body sagging as tension drained away. No one moved for several seconds. They waited, watching for signs of panic, pain, resistance. None came. Instead, the lion remained still. His breathing deepened slightly. His head lowered further into the snow, as if surrendering its last effort. When a gloved hand brushed gently against his shoulder to check stability, he did not recoil. He did not growl. He did not attempt to rise. He accepted the contact with quiet resignation, a fragile acknowledgement of safety. In that moment, something unspoken passed between species. Not understanding, not affection, but recognition of shared vulnerability. Darkness gathered along the valley floor. Snow continued to fall in fine, slow threads, settling over disturbed ground and smoothing the marks of labor. Above them, clouds drifted silently, erasing the last traces of fading light. Around the freed lion, breath rose and vanished, hands withdrew, and the cold returned gently, as if the land itself were exhaling after holding still for so long. For several minutes after the final restraints of ice and stone were removed, nothing happened. The lion remained where he lay, his body pressed into the snow, breathing slow and uneven, gathering strength in silence. The rescuers stayed in place, forming a wide, respectful circle, giving him space to decide his next movement without pressure. Snow continued to drift down in thin, wavering lines, softening every edge and muting every sound. Gradually a change moved through him. His shoulders shifted first, a subtle tightening of muscle beneath damp fur. One foreleg drew inward, then steadied. His head lifted a few inches, wavering slightly before settling again. The effort left him trembling, but it did not stop him. After a long pause, he tried once more, this time bracing carefully, distributing his weight with deliberate caution. When he finally rose, it was not with strength, but with patience. His hind leg touched the ground tentatively, testing the surface as though unsure it would hold. It shook faintly, then steadied. Snow slid from his mane and spine as he stood, revealing patches of darkened fur beneath. He remained upright only briefly, breathing heavily, sides rising and falling in uneven rhythm. Then, without looking back, he turned and began to walk. Each step was slow and measured. His body leaned slightly to one side, compensating for lingering weakness. His tail trailed low behind him, brushing softly against the snow. The wind pressed against his flank, carrying loose flakes across his path. Within moments, his outline blurred, then thinned, until he became little more than a shifting shadow within the storm. Someone exhaled quietly. He made it. No one responded. They stood still, listening to the wind reclaim the valley. The team began gathering their equipment in silence, movements unhurried, almost reluctant to disturb the fragile calm that had settled after his departure. Packs were lifted. Tools were secured. Footprints filled slowly with fresh snow. The landscape returned, piece by piece, to its earlier stillness. Then, at the far edge of visibility, something shifted. At first, it appeared as nothing more than a darker ripple moving through pale haze. Then another followed. And another. Shapes formed gradually, emerging from the snowfall like figures rising from water. Low to the ground. Broad-backed. Moving with quiet certainty. Lions. They came from the northern ridge, advancing in a loose line, spaced naturally, their bodies partially obscured by drifting snow. Females, young adults, and one smaller juvenile moved together, heads lowered against the wind, eyes alert. Their fur was thick with frost, their whiskers dusted white. They traveled without sound, guided by instinct and familiarity rather than sight alone. The rescuers froze. No one reached for anything. No one spoke. The pride slowed as they entered the open basin. Several paused, lifting their heads, testing the air. One female released a low, barely audible rumble, more vibration than sound. Another answered in kind. Their formation tightened slightly, bodies angling inward as they searched. From within the storm, a faint movement responded. The male emerged again, stepping unsteadily from behind a curtain of snow. His posture straightened as he approached them, exhaustion momentarily forgotten. One female moved forward first, closing the distance with measured steps. She lowered her head and brushed her muzzle against his shoulder. He leaned into the contact, eyes closing briefly. Others gathered around him, touching flanks, faces, and tails in quiet sequence. The juvenile circled once, then pressed close to his side. No sound rose above the wind. No display followed. Only presence. As the snowfall thickened, their forms merged into a single shifting silhouette, gradually dissolving into white and gray. The valley absorbed them gently, leaving behind nothing but softened tracks, drifting snow, and the low, endless whisper of winter moving across open ground. By morning, the storm had loosened its grip on the valley. The wind had quieted into a soft, wandering breath, and the clouds had begun to lift, revealing thin breaks of pale winter sky. Light filtered through in scattered strands, touching the snow with gentle warmth and turning frozen surfaces into fields of muted silver. The world felt newly washed, as though the night had carried away its weight and returned only what was necessary. Along the lower slope the Pride moved slowly. They traveled in loose formation, unhurried, their bodies dark against the bright ground. The injured male remained near the center, supported by instinctive positioning rather than physical contact. His stride was still uneven but stronger than before. Each step landed with more certainty, his weight shifting more evenly across all four limbs. From time to time he paused, lifting his head to draw in the thin mountain air, then continued without prompting. The others adjusted around him naturally. One female lingered close to his weaker side. Another moved ahead, scanning the terrain. The younger lion followed in their shadow, placing each paw carefully into existing prints. No signals were exchanged. No sounds were made. Their coordination flowed from shared history and quiet awareness. Behind them, their tracks stretched across the valley floor in gentle curves and overlapping lines. Some were deep and sharply defined, others faint where snow had already begun to settle again. Wind traced soft patterns between them, slowly erasing edges, blending past movement into present stillness. With every passing minute, the marks grew lighter, as if the land itself were deciding what to remember. From a distant rise, the rescuers watched. They had remained longer than required, standing in place long after equipment was secured and routes were cleared. No one checked their watches. No one spoke. Their eyes followed the Pride's gradual ascent toward the rocky ridges where snow thinned and dark stone broke through. The animals grew smaller with distance, shapes dissolving into texture, then into shadow. One ranger finally murmured almost to herself, "They'll be all right." A colleague nodded quietly. "He's strong." The words were simple, unadorned, offered without certainty, yet carried with them the weight of everything that had passed between storm and silence. As the lions reached the first line of exposed rock, they paused briefly. Several turned their heads, surveying the valley below. The injured male stood still for a moment longer than the others, his chest rising in slow, steady rhythm. Then, as if on cue, he followed, disappearing with his pride into narrow passages of stone and snow. Nothing remained but tracks. And even those did not last. Sunlight strengthened as the hours passed, softening the surface layer of snow. Wind lifted loose crystals and carried them across the basin. One by one, the deepest impressions blurred. Edges collapsed inward. Lines faded into pale suggestions of movement that only careful eyes could trace. The rescuers began their descent in quiet sequence. Packs settled onto shoulders. Boots pressed fresh patterns beside old ones. Their breaths formed small clouds that vanished almost instantly. No one hurried. No one lingered. Each step carried with it the memory of slow hands on frozen stone, of steady breath in fragile bodies, of trust formed without language. It remained in the rhythm of their walking, in the way they paused instinctively for one another, in the silence they chose to keep. Behind them, the valley lay open and empty, filled with light and wind. Somewhere beyond the mountains, a pride moved forward together, leaving no sound behind, only the distant hush of grass bending gently beneath a widening sky.